Sling and Things.
Welcome to Sling and Things, a YouTube review series. So, after revisiting The Ghost Rider, which featured Pierce Brosnan, I decided that I wanted to check out something different this time around. Something faster and looser and more action-packed. Something with bullets and blood and baccarat. And since Brosnan also happened to star in one of the most celebrated action franchises in history, and since that franchise happens to be related to the number 7, and since this is the 7th episode of this series, I figured I might as well rewatch and review GoldenEye from 1995, which stars the aforementioned Pierce Brosnan in his debut as James Bond, and which was directed by Martin Campbell. There are a couple interesting aspects about this movie. For one thing, in case you don't know, it spawned a video game adaptation on the Nintendo 64 called GoldenEye 007 that was awesome. It was a smash hit. It's considered one of the greatest first-person shooters ever. And it was so popular, it was such a signature video game for kids who grew up in the 1990s that it actually supplanted the movie it was based on in terms of notoriety. Which is incredible because it's not like the James Bond movie series wasn't a big deal. And also, movie-based video games had a reputation for being horrible for a very long time. And that reputation would continue long after this game came out. So the fact that this specific Bond movie inspired one of the most legendary video games of all time is pretty remarkable. The other thing that's interesting about this movie is that it's kind of a bridge film for the Bond series. GoldenEye was the 17th Bond movie, not counting the ones that are like non-canon. And when it came out, the franchise had been languishing a little bit. The previous James Bonds had been Roger Moore, who had gotten very old in the role, and Timothy Dalton, who audiences were kind of wishy-washy about. So Brosnan took over after a 6-year layoff between Bond films, and it was a huge success. GoldenEye more than doubled the box office of Dalton's last Bond movie, and it became, at the time, the highest grossing Bond movie ever. And for good reason, I think. GoldenEye is a fun movie, and it manages to be fun without also making you feel like you need to take a cold shower afterwards. It would be a stretch to say that GoldenEye is progressive, but it is on the Bond scale. I mean, this is still very much a male-gaze fantasy movie. The whole appeal of this franchise is that Bond is practically a superhero, and you watch his films to sort of revel in the coolness of this character. He's practically invulnerable, he sleeps with a new woman every other week, he drives fancy cars, he gets to go to exotic locations, he wears a suit for a living, he's constantly hanging around casinos, he has a license to murder people, and on and on and on. But with those aspirational character traits came a bunch of traits that were terrible at first, and that reflect just how sexist people were in the early years of this franchise. In fact, if you want to see just how bad the Bond character was in the beginning, go search YouTube for a compilation of James Bond slaps, because holy crap, did he treat women like garbage. By GoldenEye, however, the character had thankfully evolved, and James Bond doesn't slap any women or force himself on anybody, although he does spend an enormous amount of time flirting. Every other word out of his mouth is either some sort of double entendre or an innuendo. And given his success rate, it's hard to blame him. Brosnan is really good in this role. I like him as Bond. He plays the character with this unflappable confidence and suaveness that fits Bond perfectly. And I don't think a lot of actors could pull off the way he portrays him. I think it's hard to play someone like this with a swagger without it coming off as grating or arrogant or smug. And that's because the Bond character doesn't have a ton of depth, even in his best movies. There's only so much range you can have while simultaneously being the coolest person on the planet. He is what he is to a large degree, and so his likability often depends on who is playing him and how they're playing him. And if the wrong person ever plays him, the whole concept kind of falls apart. It's why when people talk about who would make a good James Bond, there's usually not a lot of actors who you can point to who could actually do it for an entire film. It's a tough act to sustain, but Brosnan manages to pull it off, to his credit. GoldenEye also has a great cast of supporting characters, and what I really appreciated about them is that none of them are trying to be like James Bond, and it's sort of charming to see these polar opposite people interact with this guy who's, like, always on. Like, Joe Don Baker's in this movie as an ally to Bond, and his character is practically from another planet compared to him, because he's bumbling and folksy and out of shape. I honestly wish there were more characters like him in this franchise, because it's funny to see Bond in an odd couple role. He doesn't always have to be mingling with debonair people in tuxedos. The standout supporting performance, though, has to go to Judi Dench, who makes her first appearance as M in this movie. She is only in GoldenEye for like 5 minutes, but she owns the screen when she's on it. And at one point, she flat out tells Bond to his face that he is a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, which was awesome of the movie to do. I admire that this film had the self-confidence to call out its main character like that and to sort of address the criticisms that people had had about this character for years and years. It was pretty brave of the movie to take a moment to puncture the image of this guy while they're also trying to build him up. And to be fair, M's critique is just a temporary roadblock. It's not like Bond changed his ways after hearing her say that. But hey, it's still nice that it's in the movie. Now, you might have noticed that I have not yet talked about the plot of this film, and that's because the plots of most Bond movies are sort of interchangeable. Usually in these movies, there's a rich megalomaniac who either wants to blow up a chunk of the earth, or they want to steal a ton of money, or control some sort of weapon, and usually there's a scar on their face, and somehow their evil scheme involves a countdown timer that Bond must stop before it goes off. And you get all of those ingredients in GoldenEye. The plot is not the draw of this movie. It's the action. It's getting to see James Bond mow down bad guys and perform crazy stunts and somehow survive a series of obstacles that would kill a normal person immediately. And there are some great action scenes in this film. GoldenEye has one of the best chase scenes I've ever seen. And I'm not normally a fan of chase scenes, honestly. I think they can be self-indulgent. I think they can go on for way too long and interrupt the flow of a story. But in this movie, you get to see a chase scene where James Bond drives a tank and goes after a villain in it. And it's a totally ridiculous moment because you watch it and it's hard not to think, wow, this is like the least clandestine thing a secret agent could ever possibly do. He should be the most famous person in the world after doing this. But it doesn't matter because you watch that scene and the classic Bond theme is playing the whole time while he's driving over vehicles in the tank, and it's just impossible to watch it without smiling and thinking, alright, I admit it, this is cool. I'm glad I'm watching this right now. That said, GoldenEye has a bunch of silly elements in it that are typical of these 20th century Bond films, and that you sort of have to tolerate if you're going to enjoy it. For example, there are several Austin Powers-y moments in this story where the bad guy could absolutely kill James Bond if they wanted to. Like, they have him dead to rights, but instead of doing that, they do that preening thing where they're like, well, James, I've decided that although I could shoot you right now, and even though I was trying to do that mere seconds ago, I'm instead going to tie you up and put you in a helicopter and have the helicopter fire missiles at itself, and then I'm gonna walk away and just assume that you won't escape this, even though I haven't actually secured the helicopter so that you can't do this. Also, I'm not even gonna check to confirm that you were killed. Okay, I'm walking away now, bye. Yeah. And even discounting that, there is plenty of cheese in this movie. And unfortunately, that cheese gets in the way of the story at times. So, this franchise vacillates on how straight and gritty it wants to be. There are versions of Bond that are dark and violent and brooding, and then there are Bond flicks that are incredibly corny and absurd, in which silly, cringeworthy things are happening left and right. GoldenEye falls in the middle of that spectrum, and it mostly does a good job of balancing tension while also stopping to throw in a one-liner. It's dramatic but fun, and I like that it doesn't abandon one for the other. But that element of cheese keeps the film from ever really connecting on a deep emotional level. Like, there's a scene near the end of the movie where Bond reflects on his mission right before he goes off to save the world, and that scene doesn't feel like it fits in this movie at all. It's hard to take it seriously. GoldenEye spends so much time getting you to accept the less realistic, less grounded parts of this world, that when it comes to a screeching halt to try to have a real moment, it doesn't feel earned. Case in point, this movie features a sadistic henchwoman named Onatop, get it, who moans very loudly every time she hurts someone. And you can't have a character like that in a movie like this, and then have a scene where Bond is ruminating on his purpose in life without it seeming ridiculous. It's a tonal shift that this film isn't capable of executing. And I think if GoldenEye was like 10% less jokey, 10% less schlocky at times, I think it would have amplified the movie. I think it would have lent a little bit more gravitas to the parts of the film that it wants you to take seriously. And it would have elevated this from being a really, really good movie to being a must-see classic. Even with that critique, though, GoldenEye is definitely an upper echelon Bond movie. It doesn't reinvent the wheel. It isn't as radical as, say, the Daniel Craig movies. But it manages to preserve the enjoyable elements of this series without also displaying bad ones. It's a nice step towards modernizing the franchise. If you've got 2 hours to kill, and if you're in the mood for an action movie with cool set pieces, I can confirm that this is still highly watchable. Also, 2 Hours to Kill is actually a pretty good name for a potential Bond movie now that I think about it. But anyway, yeah. GoldenEye, I dig it. It gets the Sling and Things seal of approval. And normally this is where I'd end my review, but first, I want to set up the thing I'm reviewing next time, because in episode 8, I will be examining an aspect of the game that I've been playing in the background throughout this entire series, Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4, or Marvel's Spider-Man, as it's officially known. I'm 7 videos in, and I haven't really talked much about this game. It's mostly been window dressing so far. But that's about to change, and the aspect of it that I'm reviewing is one that had not been thoroughly explored by anyone until now. It's a bit of a departure from my previous episodes, which is why I feel the need to babble about it like this. But since this Spider-Man game is woven into the DNA of this series, I think it fits, and I think you'll enjoy what I've got cooking up. And if you don't, then, oh well.